Is the chair of the Department of Genetics here in Cambridge. He's head of the Laboratory of Microbial Genetics and Plasmid Biology. He's also a fellow at Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge. And then on my immediate left, we have Professor John Hedley Brooke, who was previously the Andreas Idros Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford and edited a number of journals of the history of science. For example, the British Journal for the History of Science previously. He's an expert on the history of Darwin, the reception of Darwin, and he's also president of the International Society for Science and Religion. And then on my immediate right, we welcome Reiss, Professor Michael Reiss, who's Professor of Science Education at the Institute of Education in London, has a very strong background in biology, and has a particular interest in the handling of the teaching of evolution in schools. Perhaps I'll express it like that. And then on my far right is Professor Simon Conway Morris, who's a Professor of Evolutionary Paleobiology here in the Earth Sciences Department, also a Fellow at St. John's College. He's also the author of Life Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe, a book on our bookstall. So let me just explain our format then for this afternoon. In a moment I'm going to ask each panel member to introduce themselves and their sort of perspective on this whole question of God and Darwin in just a few minutes, not more than 5 minutes. And then we'll perhaps have a little bit of a panel discussion. But we do want to make sure that the major part of the time this afternoon is over to our wonderful audience who will be addressing their questions to the panel. At the end, there will be refreshments at the back. The back means either side up the stairs, and in the hall, the space behind there are some refreshments. There's also a bookstall, and I hope also an opportunity to chat with some of the panel members if they're able to stay behind for a cup of tea afterwards. So that's the format for this afternoon. So without more ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. David Summers and ask him to, sorry, not to Dr. David Summers, hand over to John Hedley Brooke. We're going to start obviously with history, start at the beginning, and John is going to give us a few minutes. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Is that a comfortable level on volume? Fine. Here's your starter for 10. Who said this? It seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. Was it the Reverend Charles Kingsley, who was one of Darwin's first converts to evolution? Or was it Charles Darwin? Let's have a vote. Who would vote for Kingsley? And who would vote for Darwin? Oh, well, there you go. It was Darwin. Who wrote this? I can see no reason why a man or other animal may not have been produced by laws, and that all these laws may have been expressly designed by an omniscient creator who foresaw every future event and consequence. Is that Asa Gray, the devout Presbyterian at Harvard, who was Darwin's great popularizer in the United States? Or was it Charles Darwin, who was in correspondence with Asa Gray at the time? Now, this could be a catch question. But let's have a vote. Is it Asa Gray? Or is it Charles Darwin? Okay, now there's one here that will catch you out. Oh, the answer. It was Darwin. Now, who said this? Samuel Wilberforce, Bishop of Oxford? Or Thomas Henry Huxley, who allegedly gave him a trouncing at that famous British Association meeting in the summer of 1860? Now listen carefully. The antagonism between science and religion, about which we hear so much, and we do, don't we, appears to me to be purely factitious, fabricated, On the one hand, by short-sighted religious people who confound a certain branch of science, namely theology, with religion, and on the other, by equally short-sighted scientific people who forget that science takes for its province only that which is susceptible of clear intellectual comprehension, and that outside the boundaries of that province they must be content with imagination, with hope, and with ignorance. Okay, Samuel Wilberforce? Or Thomas Henry Huxley? Good. Well, it's interesting. I might have predicted a slightly different distribution, but you are all very canny people. And who was it? Well, it was, of course, Huxley. The antagonism between science and religion is a fabrication. And that from Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Henry Huxley. The reason I wanted to put those little questions to you was simply to draw attention to the fact that we need to beware of our soundbite culture and all the simplifications on science and religion that we hear from whichever source they may come. What Darwin believed about God is not a simple question. And speaking as a historian, I would say one of the reasons why it isn't is that he, like many great scientists, had a kind of religious odyssey. His views changed over time, from having prepared for a life in the Christian ministry. He became, at the time he wrote The Origin, a deist, that is, he still believes in some kind of transcendent creator. Late in life, he becomes more agnostic. But even during that agnostic phase, he says that my views often fluctuate. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I deserve to be called a theist. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, the feeling gradually recedes. And I think he doesn't tell us what happens on Sundays. So we're not dealing with a straightforward question. And Darwin's views about God are nuanced. Much of what he writes about religion is nuanced. And I say this because even in his agnostic phases, he will say things like, I cannot believe that this wonderful universe is the result of chance. But then comes the nuance, and this is why we love Darwin so much, because he's humble and he's honest. He says, can I trust my own convictions if my own mind is itself the product of evolution? Can I even trust my convictions? Is the mind able to cope with these deep metaphysical and theological questions? Well, I just about had my 5 minutes, but I wanted to say something very briefly about the response to Darwin's theory, because of course there are figures like Wilberforce in Oxford who come to epitomize a Christian reaction against Darwin. And we know there are good reasons why Christian philosophers and thinkers would be disturbed, sometimes deeply disturbed, by what Darwin had to say. But there were good reasons also why Christian thinkers could warm to Darwin's theory. Charles Kingsley felt it was truly an ennobling vision of nature and of God, a God who could make things make themselves. Asa Gray, to whom I referred a few moments ago, warmed to Darwin's theory because it unified the whole of humankind. No longer could you argue that there were separate primordial races which could itself justify slavery and racist attitudes. Darwin undercuts that as far as Gray is concerned. Frederick Temple, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1880s, preached a sermon in Oxford in 1816, in which he is quite welcoming to the expansion of scientific naturalism, saying that the more we can explain by physical laws, the more does it seem reasonable to suppose that there may be moral laws to whom human beings are answerable. So there's just 3 very quick examples. Christian philosophers, one of whom became Archbishop of Canterbury, responding in a very positive way to what Darwin had suggested. So the essence of what I want to say, just in these introductory remarks, is we're dealing here with complexity, we're dealing with fascinating issues, and let us beware the sound bites.
Thank you. Dr. Reiss, over to you. Is there a seat for the gentleman? Somebody's going to get up their seat. Thank you very much.
So, God and Darwin. I believe in them both, and I don't fall over when I get out of bed in the morning. I believe that there is convincing evidence for natural selection and for the evolution of species, because I see it happening in my laboratory. There is evidence at the molecular level of genes and proteins for the interrelatedness of living things, entirely consistent, demanding that we consider a descent from common ancestors. I also believe that there is evidence for the possibility of a personal relationship between human beings and God. And finally, I believe that the nature of evidence with which we come to these conclusions differs in science and theology. But don't just take my word for it. I want to copy my colleague a little and start by having one or two quotations. I'm going to quote a world expert on the subject of evolution, not Darwin this time. This is a man called R.A. Fisher. He made the most important contributions to evolutionary theory in the 20th century and put the study of evolutionary biology onto a quantitative footing. A man of science, he wrote, is engaged professionally in a particular sort of task. This is by such means as are available, particularly by observation and experiment, to acquire a better understanding of the world in which we find ourselves. Stated simply in this way, such a profession would seem by no means incompatible with religious beliefs, such as that this world is the outcome of the creative activity of a personal God, or that the Creator has an affection for his creatures, or more specifically, that a historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, exhibited and taught the perfect way of life, which God desires human beings to follow in a spirit of gratitude and confidence. And this from the mouth of one of the major 20th century contributors to the development of evolutionary thought post-Darwin. But even in the 1950s, when he wrote this, Fisher was very concerned to see that in society there was a growing propaganda that science is anti-religion and religion is anti-science. And he feared this idea which he didn't believe in, but he saw being promoted in education and spreading through the population. And this remains a very serious problem for us all today. But the belief in the compatibility of science and religion is much older than Fisher or Darwin. We can go much further back. We can go back to the time when the knowledge of the ancient Greeks was being discovered in the Middle Ages by Western theologians. We have people like Roger Bacon, who campaigned to save the rediscovered knowledge of Aristotle from its critics, believing it would be useful in pursuit of theological understanding. And Thomas Aquinas, who said, I think, perhaps the most perceptive thing, that there is scientific thought, he wouldn't have used that term, but scientific thought and theology. And scientific thinking belongs in the scientific sphere. Theological thinking belongs in the theological sphere. And when they cross over, we make fools of ourselves. And I think this is something we have to address today. We have to try to define the boundaries of scientific and theological thought. And that's quite difficult to do because those boundaries move over time. And that's what causes the pain. God used to live in the gaps in our knowledge. We used to invoke God to explain earthquakes, to explain volcanoes, to explain storms. I don't think anyone would want to do that now. We used to invoke God to explain eclipses. Who would want to do that now? And now the origins of life and evolution, and who knows what in the future, the nature of consciousness, the nature of thought. We are moving the boundaries, we're pushing back those areas where we felt it necessary to invoke God. And as our understanding of the universe increases, I think this is a good thing. Scientific understanding increases, and that makes us focus more and more closely on the true nature of God. We can understand the true nature of God better if we're not wasting our time thinking that God is shaking the earth every time there's an earthquake. But this is a painful process. Moving the boundaries between science and theology is a painful process. Just think of Galileo, being threatened by torture, with torture by the Holy Inquisition, for appearing to move the earth away from the centre of the universe. Who would be alarmed by that now? The suggestion that humanity is no longer at the very centre of the universe then seemed to be an unbearable threat to the ascendancy of God. How much we've changed in quite a short time. So back to Darwin. The theory of evolution by natural selection is a wonderful and simple idea. I think I should state it as a geneticist. It begins by observing that individuals compete for resources. And the ability to compete varies. Some are better competitors than others. And at least some of this variation in the ability to compete is down to the genes that you inherited from your parents. That's a really important part of it. The best competitors have the most offspring, so the character is defined by successful genes, genes that make you compete better, increase in frequency in the population. And we define success simply by successful reproduction. That's all evolution by natural selection is all about. It's being more successful at reproducing, nothing else. The more fit and healthy offspring you produce, the more successful you have been. Now, like all successful, simple, powerful ideas, Darwin's theory can be taken much too far. And in the early part of the 20th century, a combination of Gregor Mendel's trailblazing work on the fundamentals of genetics in the middle of the 19th century, and Darwin's ideas on natural selection played its part in the rise of the eugenics movement and started humanity on a path which led in the end to the Nazi death camps. We are not robots programmed by natural selection. There is room in the universe enough for both God and Darwin, as long as the extremists on both sides will allow it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And now over to Professor Reiss.
Good afternoon. I too am somebody who sees Darwinian thinking and Darwin himself as having had a considerable influence on people such as me who have religious faith, on the way we understand God and God's action in the world. And let me start by giving the full version of a quotation from Charles Kingsley, to whom John referred. And this was after Kingsley had been sent a pre-publication copy of On the Origin of Species. I'm sorry, is that better for people at the back? Thank you. So I wanted to quote, this is from a pre-publication copy that Kingsley was sent On the Origin of Species. And Kingsley wrote to Darwin 6 days before it was published. He wrote on the 18th of November, 1859. I have gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of deity to believe that he created primal forms capable of self-development into all forms needful pro tempore and pro loci, as to believe that he required a fresh act of intervention to supply the lacunas which he himself made. And the particular reason I wanted to give that quote is because it's illustrative of the fact that I think religion is often influenced by science, whereas science pretty much is not and should not be influenced by religion. Now, some people with religious faith find that rather threatening, the idea that science can affect religion, whereas religious understandings should not affect how scientists work. But I don't think that needs to be the case. Think, for example, about the relationship between mathematics and science. Mathematics has a huge effect on the way science is undertaken and the way that as scientists we can see the world. Science doesn't really have much, if any, effect on the way mathematics is undertaken. But that doesn't, in a sense, devalue science. It's just the nature of maths and the nature of science. In the same way, for somebody like me, who comes from a fairly conventional scientific background with doctorate and postdoctorate in evolutionary biology, but is also, as somebody, a priest in the Church of England, for me, because I inhabit a single worldview, I'm very comfortable, of course, with the idea that we can understand something about the nature of God through the natural world. In other words, through science. And for those of you who may not have religious faith or any thought, you can just sort of cheerfully imagine for a second or two that you are God. I may spend a lot of the time doing this already, I don't know. But if you were, it wouldn't be at all surprising that something of the entire universe that you have made would reveal something about yourself. And it seems to me rather wonderful that after about 13,500 billion years or so, we finally arrive at a group of 250 people who think about these questions, which couldn't have been thought about only a few tens of thousands of years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will edit Simon Corrivaris.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for making the effort to come and see us. Packed audience. I'll try and be as brief as possible. I get some pretty funny letters. No, not from the person in the back, thank you. I've already replied to yours. And one I actually had, which rather touched me a couple of days ago, was from a clergyman. I don't get so many of those. Well, one from Mike and the other. To the effect that, in fact, he was actually very concerned. He'd been watching various programmes on the box in the last few days, which go around the Darwin circuit, as I think Denis mentioned in his introduction. And he felt his faith was really under attack. And I have to say straight away, not only do I sympathise with his difficulties, but so I do with almost the majority of people now who suspect that the universe they see around them is one which is, for all intents and purposes, devoid of meaning. And I think it's a case that, in large part, that is an inspiration, though I think also a misreading, of the ideas of Charles Darwin, in as much as we look towards randomness in so many of the evolutionary operations, things called mutations, big rocks falling out of the sky and randomly removing one species but not another one. It all seems to be an enormous lottery. So when people find scientific ideas, especially those which devolve immediately on who we are, if people say that they're being simplistic because they look corrosive, it's not simplistic at all. This goes to the very heart of who we think we are. And unfortunately, science can reveal some very uncomfortable truths, if they are truths, and I think they are. So there's a background to this which I think needs to be put in context. We should be optimistic about it. A couple other things I might just very briefly say. The first is, and I'm mildly surprised it wasn't mentioned by the other members of the panel, but it's probably just as well, is that of course many people today, especially in the United States, but by no means exclusively there, look to alternative ideas which largely revolve around this principle of so-called intelligent design. I dare say some people here actually think it's a viable theory. Very briefly, the reason I don't think it works is actually twofold. First of all, it isn't science, and therefore we simply can't do it as science. More importantly, in my view, it's actually really terrible theology, just dreadful. It doesn't tell you anything about God except that he doesn't have a big white beard, he has a big white coat. He spends all his time doing off-the-record chemical experiments. And that doesn't seem to be a very helpful way of looking at something like God. So far as Darwin is concerned, so far as our view of evolution is concerned, I don't think there's any doubt at all about our evolutionary origins, but I think there are one or two things which might be worth putting in slightly different context. David mentioned in passing the problem of the origin of life. Origin of life study is one of the great scientific failures of the last 50 years, which simply means we're not asking the right question in the right place. It's actually a realistic possibility it was a complete and utter fluke. We can't prove that, that's hardly a scientific statement. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the total mystery as to, though we all take it for granted, we wake up having dreamt, which actually is very strange, even sleep is strange. But despite all that, we are conscious. And Darwin had a throwaway remark about brain secreting thought. If you think that's a solution to what is a very profound mystery at the moment, then I think we need to think again. Now, none of these things are immune to scientific investigation, but what I would first of all suggest is the sort of science which is going to explain those things will be a post-Darwinian science, because Darwin is simply a mechanism to explain, as again was explained very briefly, how natural selection works. It's as interesting as what we call ionic bonding, which explains how molecules stick together. But if you're interested in the way molecules stick together, you then are interested in what is the nature of the atomic periodic table. And you ask yourself, why is it so structured? And I think the same will turn out to be true of evolution. What I think is so interesting, especially at the moment, is it's very odd. The more we understand about ourselves, the closer we are to animals. You know, here I am, a naked ape, of course. Our common ancestor, which wasn't a chimpanzee, but was like a chimpanzee in some respects, probably lived about 8 million years ago. Yet now, again, as was mentioned by Michael, we are completely and utterly different. Moreover, that transition occurred rather rapidly and halfway through the history of our own species, again for reasons which are not particularly clear. Now, I shouldn't really mention this in public, but I was in Vancouver a few weeks ago in a large bookstore, and I came across a book written by an Australian philosopher called David Stove, and it had the terrible title, and I want anybody here with children to make sure their ears are completely covered because they must not take this information away. They may not be the same again. The book was called Darwinian Fairy Tales. Oh dear. I have no doubt Darwin is absolutely correct, but I also think that all of our views of science are looked through various lenses and spectacles of myth and pre-assumptions. Stove, in outline, effectively argues that it's fine to say that we are the product of evolution, so we are all the things we see in animals. Animals, for instance, have independently evolved technology. Did you know that? Animals have independently invented cognitive landscapes which are the same as ours. That's the thing we call evolutionary convergence. But why Stove is so insistent is that the things which actually make us human, and of course one of the unique things which is universal, even if you're an atheist, believe it or not, is religion. But more particularly, he suggests that the sorts of arguments which look towards the ant colony, for example, or the way birds breed, to be the explanation of how we are as we are now, not as a product of evolution, but how we see the universe and how we understand it, where we want to go with it, is something which has transcended Darwin completely. And you can take a religious perspective on this and simply say, evolution, very simply, is a search engine. It's a way in which the universe becomes self-aware, and by a miracle, here we are. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed to the panel for getting us off to a flying start, and I hope that stimulated lots of thoughts and questions. I mentioned at the beginning we might have a little brief discussion on the panel first, but given the number of people here and the limitations on time, I know that lots of people here with questions. I think we'll pass on that, because we'll have plenty of chance for interaction on the panel as we go along. We really want to give the rest of the time to you, the audience, to address your questions to the panel. Can I just remind you a couple of practical things? One is, I'm afraid we've only got one roving mic, which is obviously not going to reach down here in time, so we're going to waste a lot of time if we wait for the roving mic. So I'm actually going to suggest that people just shout, and if necessary, I will be happy to repeat the question if I can hear it. So do speak up loudly. Let me remind you that the scope of our topic this afternoon is Darwin, God and Evolution. So if you have questions on global warming, that's wonderful. I'm glad you're interested in that. This is not the time, to ask that question. Okay, just to remind you what the topic is. I know it's been a busy week. Those taking part in the Science Festival, and your mind is full of many issues. But this is about Darwin, God and Evolution. I would be grateful if you could keep your questions brief. This isn't really the time for speeches. We know you have a lot of things to say, but we would prefer if you could just brief comment if you like, but really make it a clear question. Because I think people here have really come to interact with the panel. So that's really my general comments. And so it's really over to you. And who would like to ask the first question? Over here. And if we have got time to get the mic to you, of course we will. And as it happens, you're very close to the mic. That was extremely well planned, actually. Well done. So there aren't many people close to the mic. I think it's switched on. And it's just going to come to ask your first question. Thank you, sir.
May I ask the panel, what evolutionary change took place when God breathed into the nostrils of Adam and he became a human being?
Well, we've got a cleric here who has left his dog collar behind, so I think we should go to him first. What do you think?
Though my answer is nothing to do with me particularly being ordained, I see for myself that what happened was consistent entirely with the way evolution had already been working. That as organisms became more and more complicated, they finally got to the point, and I think Simon was suggesting this as well, where they began to reflect more and more on themselves and on the world in which they were living. And what more beautiful way of putting that than in the words that are at the beginning of the Jewish scriptures?
It's a very fair point, and I think the reading which you're referring to in a certain sense goes back to roughly 800 BC, and things have moved on in a number of ways, but nevertheless that fundamental truth can still be identified and reconstrued in particular ways. But there are religious perspectives, Christian is one of them, but it's certainly true of other religions as well, which regards the whole argument not only to involve ourselves but the whole of creation. And if that's the case, then whatever creation makes in terms of self-awareness is only part of that story. And it's possible, in fact, out in the whole of creation will be self-aware, not just us.
Simon, sorry, I'm just going to press you, Simon, on that a little bit. When you said the whole creation being self-aware, do you mean plants are thinking thoughts themselves? Can you just unwrap that a little bit for us, what that means? Some people might misunderstand, I think, what you might be saying there.
Well, I'm very glad to see the mother and father of Prince Charles in the background. Good evening, ma'am. And more particularly, Prince Charles would be regarded as somebody who sometimes identified with tree huggers. No, I wasn't thinking quite of that. Actually, there are serious books, again, I'm more serious, you've already noticed, called Plant Neurobiology. It's worth mentioning in passing that, of course, you and I look at each other and engage in mental processing, and it's almost entirely a chemical process. How it happens is utterly mysterious. If it is a chemical process, at least in part it must be. I don't think that's the whole story by any means. Then I would be quite wary about assuming that supposedly non-conscious life forms are quite as dim as we think. I would leave this open to scientific investigation, but do not assume that things stand in trees, stand in parks, are necessary and sentient.
On the original question, any other comments from anybody, or shall we move on? Do you want to do it?
Partly on what Simon said on the original question, the complexity of living things is something we are continuing to discover. And as we do that, we find ourselves closer and closer to the most surprising organisms. I spend my day job working on E. coli, which I suppose most people find supremely unattractive, and probably think of as a very, very simple, single-celled organism. One of the greatest steps forward in bacteriology in the last 10 or 15 years has been to understand that bacteria themselves communicate, they form societies, different species of bacteria interact with one another in the most extraordinarily complicated ways. However, I doubt that they are self-aware, but they are at least social.
I'd just like to add one thing to what Michael said about the story to which reference was made as a very beautiful way of expressing what we might describe as an existential truth about our self-awareness. And I think what I would want to say is that there clearly was a stage in human evolution, I doubt it happened overnight, when there was a sense of kind of responsibility to enter into some kind of relationship, or an awareness that a relationship might be possible with a transcendent being, a creator of some kind. And that whole story of the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, again I think does express a very profound existential truth, an awareness that one is not perhaps able to, or is not living up to the highest expectations that one may even set for oneself. And in terms of a relationship with God, I'm always struck by that text in the Genesis story, where God asks Adam, where are you, Adam? It's almost as if Adam is hiding from God. And I think that sense of being aware that there is the possibility of a relationship with a transcendent other, and yet also hiding from that relationship. I think that is very nicely captured in the story of the fall. So that's just a small addition to what Michael said.
Thank you very much. We'll have another question, and I think we're going to move over that side now. Gentleman up there, yes, please. Yes. Yes.
Is atheism a product of evolution?
Thank you. If everyone heard that, is atheism a product of evolution? Anybody decide?
No.
Yes. There may not be a fundamental difference between us, but so my understanding of God is very much, and this is a scriptural analogy, of a parent who gives freedom to a child. Not infinite freedom, because you don't, that would be a bit stupid, but as children grow, you give them more and more freedom. So one of the freedoms that God has given us is precisely to try and understand God And therefore, Ken, because I know you, I think it's rather wonderful that both you and I can live in this world. I'm sorry, it's different persons, not Ken. But I think it's rather wonderful that you and I can live in this world and perhaps come to very different understandings about the role of God in the world. But I do think God therefore does allow, through evolution, through mental capacity, different ways of understanding God.
Any other comments from any other members of the panel? David, did you want to?
I think I just add that I don't see primarily atheism or theology as being the product of evolution, but that the human brain is the product of evolution, and therefore The Simpsons and Big Brother and the Premier League, which have all been created by the human mind, are all in the same sense products of evolution.
Thank you. Another question from the floor, please. Yes, right in the middle. Yep.
I was just wondering about Darwin, how he came to terms with the end of his life, what he thought, was he just like his time had come, or was he going into the hands of God?
There is a mythology about Darwin's last days, which one can understand might have gained in popularity in certain conservative, evangelical and fundamentalist circles. And the mythology is that right at the end of his life he said that he repented of all that he'd done, and in a sense he renounces the theory. You'll not be surprised to learn that there is virtually no evidence for that. What I think one has to be aware of, however, is that in Victorian England, one of the most popular arguments for the existence of God was the fact that people on their deathbed did repent. That was considered a more powerful argument than the argument from design, which is the argument we usually hear about in the Darwinian context. As far as I know, there is no repentance, and Darwin, I think, could look back with enormous pride but also humility on the very great contribution he'd made to human understanding.
Thank you very much. That's very clear. We've got a question down here. So yes, at the front row. Yes, thank you. We might need the microphone. I don't know if our microphone man can just reach you. I think it's a fairly easy journey. Well, I'm not sure it'll carry it up that way. That's the trouble. So there we go. Yeah, thank you very much.
I'd like to make just a comment. Before coming here, the last few days, I read your article on why are Christians passionate Darwinians. I thought it's a very good article, but at the end of it, I thought Denis Alexander is a flatlander anyway, because his perception of is not adequately expressed in that. And the other point I would like to make about science and religion in this context is that the way I perceive it, the Judeo-Christian religion is mainly concerned with the disclosures of the name of God and the attributes of God. And as far as science is concerned, it is essentially concerned with defining patterns of relationship and then enlarging that perception whenever required, when you have new information which won't fit in with a pattern. The real problem is, in science, there is the freedom to enlarge the perception, but when it comes to the Judeo-Christian view, there isn't that freedom to enlarge the perception of God, the name of God and the attributes of God, and this is the real problem, as I see it.
The only single comment I'd make is I'm probably more optimistic than you are about the ability within certainly the Christian understanding of the world to continue to develop and think. One of the great advantages for Christians is an awareness that the scriptures, which for Christians are, in my view, central, were formed over very long periods of time. I believe they're inspired by God. But there's that wonderful fact that if you read, for example, the four Gospels very carefully, while of course they give one a consistent picture about the person of Jesus, they also show within themselves a development of thought about Jesus, which is carried on into Acts and then subsequently in the world of the early church and beyond. So I think there's a tremendous scope for us to try to develop our understanding of God. And indeed, going back to my earlier question of this role play activity that some of you have entered into, but a lot of you don't really seem to have got into it yet, of imagining your God. if you are really God, it's going to be very difficult to disclose everything about yourself at one time. It's going to take a great deal of time for your own creation to begin to understand you.
It's not in keeping with the development and disclosures of science. That is the point I'm making.
Okay, I don't know if any of the panel members wanted to comment or move on. Thank you. Okay, we're going to have a question now. We want somewhere different. Let's go, yeah, female up here at the top. Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry to gesture in that way, but I can hardly see you up there, so thank you very much. Yeah.
With the way humans are going at the moment, do you think it's possible that evolution could possibly go backwards or even stop altogether?
So, there's a whole variety of approaches on this, and Steve Jones is probably most well known recently for arguing that, I hope I paraphrase him correctly here, that for all intents and purposes we're not evolving. Actually, we are evolving all the time. We're always subjected to new pathogen and epidemics, things like that. We have to adapt, and this will actually be very important, although we're not allowed to talk about global warming, but if indeed the worst predictions come out, there will be very dramatic changes in resistance to various diseases necessarily, obviously assisted by medicine. But I think more particularly, no, I don't think so. I mean, the point now is the sort of evolution we are involved with is ironically much more similar to a Lamarckian evolution, and of course, as I was intimating, the fact that we can store our information in libraries and now these extraordinary databases, and you can teach children now what was thought in the 1920s to be only capable of understanding by a handful of the most intelligent men on the planet, that's general relativity. Okay, so things change the whole time. Of course we can muck things up, but I think on the other hand, surely we're too sensible to do that now.
I just wanted to pick up very quickly on an interesting phrase in your question, which was evolution going backwards. And I think in that is a popular concept that somehow what evolution is about is improvement all of the time. We will get more and more intelligent, more and more tall, more and more beautiful. And somehow if we became more ugly or less intelligent, evolution would be going backwards. But actually, if the environment changes in such a way that less intelligent people have more children, then evolution will still be going forward, and the result will be a loss of intelligence and increasing stupidity. Evolution has got an end point, you see. It just ploughs on in a rather stupid, blind way. It's a slightly depressing thought. Sorry.
David, is that really what you tell your students when they come up to Cambridge? Right, today's educational thought. Okay, and let's go to the balcony on the other side. Speaking of the balcony, Johnson, you said, yes?
In the beginning of the introduction, it was mentioned that maybe a creationist God creates the laws of the universe as laws of physics. But in this case, I think this creationist God should identify himself or itself on these laws. Otherwise, it doesn't belong to the universe. What's your opinion about it?
Well, the way that I see it is that God partly reveals himself, herself, in the universe, does it in a way that allows people to come increasingly to understanding and a belief, but doesn't force them to. So it's a rather delicate relationship. It's an open-ended one.
Yeah. Can I?
Yes. Do you want to clarify your question slightly? Because in case that wasn't addressed.
If we are discovering the laws of the universe, and we are not discovering God, because God is only showing us the laws of the universe, as you mentioned, then God is not part of the universe. Because we're discovering the universe, but not him. Or he.
I mean, very briefly, none of the panel may want to comment. The relationship between God and the universe is one that theologians in all the world's religions have wrestled with over quite a while, and I think I now see better the point you're making. Clearly, in one sense, God sits, if you do have a faith in God, God sits outside the universe is created by God, but in one sense, the universe is a sort of extension of God. So it's perfectly possible to imagine that there are elements of the universe that reveal something of the nature of God. And that's, roughly speaking, the theological position that I would hold. So speaking ever so loosely, and there is this very strong strand in theology that trying to talk about the nature of God is a pretty pointless exercise anyway, but speaking very loosely, you could say, well, God seems to have a certain patience, because the universe has been around quite a long time, in human terms, before anything evolved that could have these sort of discussions on a Saturday afternoon. God seems to also have quite an enjoyment about diversity, because there's a lot of diversity of life, there's a lot of diversity of stars, etc., etc. So there's a sort of natural theology that can be done nowadays, trying to understand a bit more about the nature of God from the existence of the universe.
Your point's very fair. It's very difficult. May in fact not have an answer. I think there are two ways one can approach it. As mentioned, Michael mentioned natural theology. Well, very broadly, there are people like Karl Barth, for instance, who don't think it's possible. There are other people, most famously Alistair McGrath, prolific author, who does, and I like Alistair's approach very much, but I think it's one full of risks. But more particularly with regard to laws of the universe, what are those? What are the laws of the universe? Well, we have some consistencies, but for instance, there are interesting possibilities that Martin Reiss's famous just six numbers, those which are often used in an anthropic way of arguing that there's a very precise set of initiations which only those allow the universe to be habitable, particular physical constants which do seem to be pretty finely tuned. It's more than likely one day we will understand that they devolve down to some more general theory, and everybody will again be teaching it to school children and say how obvious, that's what science is rather good in hindsight. But my guess is at that stage will then be set another set of tasks with regard to what on earth is the nature of what we thought was a fundamental principle, which once again devolves backwards and backwards. And I'm perfectly happy in fact that the scientific endeavour, which is pretty depressing sometimes given the amount which is appearing at the moment, may be entirely open-ended. There may be no end to it. Corresponding with God, I very much like the quote, which actually appears rather strangely in the libretto of the opera Salome, that was written by Oscar Wilde, of course. And at one point where the disciples are talking to Herod and Herodias, and they say, he is everywhere, but he's difficult to find.
If I may just revert to Darwin himself on this, because it is so often said that his theory subverts the argument for design that had been enshrined in William Paley's text, The Natural Theology. But it's the remark about laws of nature that prompt me to say what I'm about to say. Darwin himself struggled very much with this kind of question. Can we deduce from the fact that there is order in nature? Can we deduce that there is also purpose in nature? Towards the end of his life, he rather doubted that. But at an earlier stage, when he talks to Asa Gray about this whole question of design, he comes up with a formula which, though it didn't entirely satisfy him, does at least, I think, show that his theory doesn't completely evacuate the concept of design. And what I have in mind is his statement that I'm rather inclined to see all the wondrous diversity of this world as the product of designed laws, but with the details left to chance. So there is a sense, I think, in which even Darwin himself would understand an argument which went from the perception of the regularity in nature to the affirmation that those regularities could have been designed with the high moral purpose of producing creatures like ourselves who could respond to him. I'm confident in saying that because I've read very recently an essay which I might just refer you to. It's actually by a very well-known Darwin scholar, Robert Richards, in the Cambridge Companion to the Origin of Species, where he argues that behind the Darwinian thesis is a very high sense of moral purpose in the universe, and we could amplify that in various ways. But I just wanted to take up that point, that in discovering the laws of nature, we may still see something of the divine wisdom in that process, but it's going to depend on where you're coming from, your presuppositions, and where you've got them from.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question right at the back. Yes. Thank you.
If God designed the universe, or at least laid down mechanisms which allowed it to evolve, who designed God?
the standard theological answer is that's not the right question. Nobody designed God, no thing designed God. God is God, so God is held to be eternal everywhere, for all time, all place. It's not much of an answer if one doesn't already, as it were, either understand or accept that way of thinking of it. The best analogies that are usually given, I think, are things like what happened before our universe started. And so physicists are fairly comfortable with the idea that that's not a very good question probably either, because time itself was one of the things that, roughly speaking, some physicists much better than I am here in the audience, but time itself is roughly one of the things in the space-time continuum that came into existence. It's a bit like also trying to ask, imagine you really do see what's beyond the universe. That's also another question, which isn't quite the right sort of question.
It silenced the rest of the panel, so I don't know. Must have said something right there. So, okay, I think we will just come back to the centre here and over to here. Yes, please. Your question was over. Yes.
I'm not at all clear on what the fossil evidence is for human evolution, or even if there is much in the way of fossil evidence. Could the panel enlighten me about that?
First slide, please. I'm so sorry, it's a question, is there a fossil record which bears on the early evolution of the hominids, I think, the humans, effectively. Fossil record's always incomplete, it's always controversial, there's all sorts of questions associated with the identification of fragmentary material, but in a nutshell, we actually have an extremely good record for something which is either a chimp or an early hominid at about 6 million years ago, this thing called Sahelanthropus. And then in terms of the so-called Australopithecines and through to so-called Homo erectus, in terms of becoming bipedal, increase in brain size, some evidence for care, evolution of technology, evolution of fire, evolution of culture. Actually, we have an extremely rich record. And to the first approximation, I set this essay to some of my students I was supervising. I was asking them to say, well, to what extent is evolution of humans any different from any other group? And apart from things I mentioned in my own brief peroration, there's very little indeed. No, there is a good fossil record. The other thing is, of course, that it doesn't sort of run out. You know, there are huge areas of the world which still await proper investigation. And I know this from my own work on the Cambrian explosion. What we knew 30 years ago is pathetic in comparison with what we know now. And I'm sure that's going to be the case with human evolution. So the evidence exists, yes, definitely.
I'd just like to extend that slightly, because I'm not a geologist and I've never dug up fossils. I'm sure there are plenty of them, but you know, by their very nature they are rare, and so the evidence they give you is fragmentary. The good news is that molecular biology has provided an alternative and independent history of evolution, which is in the DNA sequence. And I don't want to even try to start explaining exactly how you do it now, because it would take too long. But by analysing the way in which DNA sequences are related between species, you can see mirrored the process of evolution which produced those species. There is an interrelatedness of species which is absolutely staggering. And when I look at DNA sequence, I can relate my dear old E. coli to the humans in this room at the moment.
I knew we'd get back to bugs pretty soon, so I'm sure you know that you have 10 times more bacteria in your bodies than your own human cells. Something to think about after lunch. There's a lady, question over here, lady up here, thank you.
What do you have to say about what Richard Dawkins recently mentioned in the paper, that we're one step away from making religion irrelevant, that if we can recapitulate the chemical changes in the brain when the man encounters spiritual closeness to God, then religion doesn't exist, it's irrelevant, and that God doesn't exist. And the second question is, do you think man needs religion and God in order to come to terms with his own mortality?
Can you just repeat your second question, please? Just so we heard. So I didn't hear. Maybe the panel did.
Do you think man needs God or religion in order to come to terms with his own mortality?
Okay, so we've got two questions there. Let's just tackle the first question first, the panel. All the panel are dying to have a go. You mentioned that Dawkins has got them going here.
I'm genuinely not sure if that was Richard Dawkins or Colin Blakemore, but the point is a very good question anyway. you probably won't be surprised to gather now that my answer is going to be the fact that I'd welcome any understanding through conventional biology about why humans have religious belief. The category error is to think that because you have an evolutionary explanation for something, for example, religious belief, that devalues what you have an evolutionary explanation for. We have a very good we have good evolutionary explanations, for example, for why humans use language. That tells us nothing about the validity of the words we speak. Having an evolutionary explanation for why most humans have either a belief in God or a sort of beginnings of belief in God doesn't tell us anything about the validity of those beliefs whatsoever. I could go on to the second part of the question, but perhaps other people in the panel might want to stick with the first point.
Well, very much to echo those points. The thing is what you regard as the nature of proof and what is the nature of evidence. But in this particular case, and I don't know indeed whether it was Colin Blakemore or Richard Dawkins, these are effectively promissory notes put forward on the table. They're assumptions that they will turn out to be the case. Well, the curious thing here is that the promissory note has been around for more than a century and it's produced no real results at all. And this is particularly clear from PET scans and other brain imaging, where of course people are now looking at what they believe to be religious experiences. It's rather entertaining because effectively what it means is putting a nun horizontally into a large machine and then asking her to pray. I do wish you'd take this science more seriously. But the net result is, of course, I mean, there are areas of the brain which are active during prayer, for instance. Our problem is that, as I think a very nice recent book, James LeFanu has pointed out, along with many other people, we still haven't got the foggiest idea how the brain is interconnected and that much that different areas are igniting. The fact that the same areas, which are, from a molecular viewpoint, indistinguishable, may be involved in completely different cognitive processes. And I think it's fair to say that there is further work to be done in this area, and it's more than likely, in fact, that when we do have a proper understanding of mentality and consciousness, then that will merely show that the world is far more complex than we thought, it's far more interesting than we thought, but we know that already. And if you wish to put a religious dimension on that, you don't have to, but if you wish to, I don't think you'll be, in a sense, any further ahead or any further behind than would be the case at the moment. But I would be very wary about the sort of, if I may say so with great respect, the sort of North Oxford Islington view of life, which is sort of, well, that's that, it's all been sorted out. And I think, well, that's not the science I know.
Clearly we think about God with our brains, and to be honest, the more we use our brains to think about God, the happier I will be. We might stop burning people at the stake and actually start trying to take humanity forward in a way that's consistent with what we perceive to be the ideas of God. But I think to say that if we understand the way our brains work, when we perceive the presence of God, perhaps at prayer, perhaps in meditation, to say that once we understand that, then God ceases to exist, makes no more sense than to say, when I completely understand the physics and the electronics that explains the working of my radio, then Radio 4 ceases to exist.
Just a brief one, Dennis. Yes, I fully endorse everything that's been said, and I think Michael's point about the category mistake that tends to creep in, sometimes called the genetic fallacy. If you can explain how something has come about, it then ceases to exist, or you can cease to take it seriously. I entirely endorse that. But it's perhaps just worth adding that there are many wishful thinking prophecies of this kind that come from the secular atheist stable, and one may or may not be sympathetic with those, but they do not always seem to me very cogent. I think Dan Dennett, for example, has suggested that with the internet, it's only going to be a matter of 20 years or so before religion as we have known it will have vanished from the face of the earth, neglecting, I think, in remarks of that kind, that the internet is used by Al-Qaeda. The internet is used by all kinds of organizations who have views which I think you and I would certainly not wish to to uphold. So the notion that there is some kind of globalization of secularism doesn't seem to me to stand up to very serious examination, and sometimes it's rather frightening that it doesn't.
Good. Now, there was a second question, which I think Michael was going to get. Yeah, thank you.
I'll only say very briefly, I think the second question was to suggest one particular reason why maybe humans came to have a religious faith, and that was the idea of wrestling with what's going to happen after death. Is there immortality? In a way, again, this is a rather empirical question. It's a question maybe quite difficult to really sort out, but there are a number of authors now working on a number of different possibilities. That one doesn't tend to get as much support as some of the others for two main reasons, one of which is certainly some of the oldest religions, like Judaism, don't appear to have started with those questions as being the important questions. They're more to do with relationships between us and the divine and the whole purpose of human life, not with what happens after death.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question, and there were lots of hands before, and we've got a hand up in the answer. Yes. Yeah.
You said that religion shouldn't or doesn't influence science. I didn't quite understand that point. Do you think the rest of the panel could explain it?
Right. So if you've got Michael Reiss suggested that religion doesn't influence science, does the rest? I think we should go to the historian for that, actually.
The fact is, religion historically has influenced science, and you could actually construct a whole series of case studies, I think, to show how certain religious assumptions about the world actually shaped particular forms of science. The very notion of unintelligible order in nature was certainly in the 17th century crucial for science, and at the same time an offshoot of a theology which took the idea of creation very seriously. So I think one could trace a history, many, many examples where religious beliefs did actually shape science in some way. The question, however, is whether it is a very good idea for that to happen. And there are many more recent examples, I think, where one would not wish certain forms of religious belief to put constraints on the freedom of scientific inquiry. And we've not discussed this afternoon very much, the threat to science from the ultra-creationist lobbies around the world. But if you allowed science to be, as it were, influenced by those religious beliefs, I think we would all be deeply concerned. So there's a complicated story to be told about, first of all, the secularization of science itself, where I think one could argue that by the end of the 18th century, it was becoming increasingly rare for science positively to be influenced by religion. There are many examples in the 19th century as well. Michael Faraday would constitute a very interesting example, whose belief about the unity and correlation of forces derives from his monotheism. So the examples do continue. They rumble on through the 19th century. You could find examples from the 20th century as well. But I certainly respect the view of those scientists who would wish to say that in their detailed inquiry into the workings of nature, they don't, on a daily basis, need something from religion that enables them to do that work.
So I think the great strength of science is that it allows us to work independently of religious tradition. And by religious tradition, I mean, for example, when people were debating whether the Earth was round or whether the Earth was flat, it should be possible to design scientific experiments to distinguish those two possibilities, and they will be independent of what everybody else thinks. It doesn't matter whether the church thinks it's flat or round, or whether 99% of people in the world think it's flat or round. So science must strive actively to be not only independent of religion, but also independent of democracy and independent of political thought. independent of what the man next door thinks. What science must do is just ask questions and accept the answer that comes back with no preconceptions.
I've just been reminded by the chairman that the Church did not, for the most part, ever believe that the earth was flat, if we're talking about the Christian tradition. There are one or two church fathers, like Tantius would be an example, who did. But for the most part, and this would certainly be true of Augustine and most of the names that would be familiar to you, the spherical earth was presupposed.
Okay, good. Now, I believe there's a question, somebody that I can't quite see. Who's over here? Hello, yes, your question, sir, please. Yes. The question is, could the Holy Spirit within us possibly be a product of evolution? That sounds like a theological question.
The words are rather technical, but there's a good way of looking at the way that God acts in the world in terms of both transcendence and immanence. Transcendence is that action of God which really is not explicable, which we can't understand in terms of our everyday understanding of science. And in that sense, no, the Holy Spirit sits quite outside of the universe, because the Holy Spirit, in the classical Trinitarian understanding in Christianity, the Holy Spirit, along with God the Father and God the Son, is God. And therefore the universe perpetually derives from, is sustained by the Holy Spirit. But there's another rather nice answer, for example, the Quaker emphasis on the Spirit, which is that there's a bit of the Spirit in every one of us, without wanting to sound patronising, in everybody, whether or not they themselves have religious faith. And so that's a vision of a bit of God, in a sense, inside each of us. And I like the way that those two understandings can sit together. In one sense, the Holy Spirit must be related to our evolved mental capacities to understand ourselves, to ask these questions we've all been talking about, to be in relationships, to imagine and so forth. But in another sense, the Holy Spirit is more than that.
Okay, so we have a question over here. Yes, please. Okay, well, let's take the first question maybe to start with. The question was really about the two creation accounts in Genesis 1 compared to Genesis 2. We have sort of two accounts of creation. Who would like to reflect on that?
For many people, if they take the Jewish or Christian scriptures seriously, when they start looking at the two different accounts, they're a bit problematic, they're a bit worrying. But they can be incredibly helpful, because we've got to remember the people who literally ended up writing those things, however they were inspired to write them, those people were not did. I mean, humans are no brighter nowadays than we were probably 10, 20,000 years ago, certainly not when the scriptures were written. So it's likely that they were genuinely written to try and tell different parts of an overall story. I'm somebody very comfortable with them being inspired. In that sense, I'm comfortable seeing them as the Word of God. But it suggests that they're not meant to be read, genuinely not meant to be read, in the way that some of us have learned to read factual accounts subsequently, where there's a very straightforward one-to-one correspondence between what one's reading and what one thinks happened in the world.
I'm not a theologian, that's pretty obvious. But obviously one reads these, and if I say they're myths, then by and large people will equate that with being a fairy tale, which is not the case at all. Everybody has creation myths. The thing which is interesting about the Genesis myths, a number of other things which actually go off into the New Testament as well, story, is that they are deeply subversive, because they are referring to creation myths from extremely powerful empires who had, from the Jewish viewpoint, a deeply skewed view about how the world was, why it was made, and why in particular it was good. So the genius of these, especially the first one, is everything is turned upside down. And that's something which again is forgotten too often, is that why do we have religion at all? Well, partly it's because it's extremely subversive about who we think we might be. Be careful.
I think the second part of your question was what is the point of God for humanity? Is that right? Why is it relevant? I think that question perhaps reveals the sort of arrogance that humanity is guilty of. You know, well, what's the point of God for us? You could turn it around and ask, what is the point of us for God? Equally well. And if God exists, then it would seem to be a jolly good thing to do to try to seek to learn about God. And if that seems to be something which is helpful, to use a very simple and silly word, for the human race, then we should pursue it. And I would see it as being probably the most helpful thing we can possibly do. Science is useful in understanding humanity, but I would say that understanding the nature of God is what in the end helps us most of all to understanding the nature of humanity.
Thank you very much. I want to tell the audience, by the way, that we're sort of roughly aiming for 4:15 as wrap-up time. Now, we might take a vote almost at 4:15. Because I know a lot of people come along. I don't know, there might be things at 4:30 you definitely have to get to the other side of the city. So I don't want to extend it over long. I don't want to stop questions too short if people are dying to ask questions. We'll have one more question, and then we're going to take a vote as to whether we go on for another 5 or 10 minutes. And if, just democracy, that's what we do. Free will, productive evolution, question at the top of the stairs with a hand just sort of appearing. That's your hand. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Right, very good question if anyone heard it. So the question is really, if we're living in one giant laboratory called the universe, is it sort of set up in a way that we had to appear, or is it, as it were, accidental? And either way, does that really help us to understand God as creator? I think, Simon, this is a bit up your street, isn't it? It might be my street, it might be my cul-de-sac, let's watch. Most neo-Darwinians, and I heard a lecture from David Sloan Wilson very recently, Rome of all places now, would argue that intelligence is effectively a fortuitous byproduct of other chemical processes, and that it's for all intents and purposes an accident. For what it's worth, I think that's absolutely incorrect, and I think we can show that the fact that intelligence has repeatedly evolved suggests that it's at least likely. I would put it more strongly than that. More particularly, though, one of the general things which I mentioned in passing is that if intelligence can understand the rest of creation, I think that's wonderful. But that doesn't necessarily mean the rest of creation somehow then becomes irrelevant, and actually in its own peculiar way becomes more extraordinary. Why does it take so long? Well, who's to say what's long? We don't know. And so far as we can understand, sentience amongst humans really only seems to emerge in terms of symbolic representation, perhaps 100,000 years ago. There's a lot of debate about that, and you can shift the figure around, but I doubt it is much more than 3 million years. And from that perspective, in point of fact, the great thing about science, in its old sort of way, is actually suddenly you step into completely new worlds. And I think, in fact, there's possibly an echo of religious thinking there as well. And once you start to think about the world from that perspective, when you literally, as Newton so famously made his remarks about sitting on the shore, picking up one pebble or a certain shape's shell, playing with them, but all the time aware that he was sitting on the edge of an ocean of ignorance, then in a certain way, the fact that the universe was evidently instantiated roughly 13.6 billion years ago hardly matters. The story's finished now.
The only very brief thing I'd add is one understanding of God's knowledge of things in advance is quite literally that 13,500 million years ago, God knew you were going to ask that question. God knows what you're going to do on the way home this evening and everything that will happen the rest of your life. The other possibility is that, roughly speaking, well, God knows the shape of things that were going to happen, so God would be pretty confident eventually some creature was going to ask those sort of questions, because they're the obvious questions you'd be asking if you were reasonably bright as a creature. But God didn't know it was going to be you today, this afternoon, that there is that sort of open-endedness that not even God knows about. And the scriptures are sometimes much more comfortable with that as an idea than some religious believers are. The Old Testament, for the Christian believer, occasionally has God saying, you know, I never imagined they were going to do this sort of thing. If they had, I wouldn't. You can see God gets quite upset about these things. I wouldn't have, you know, allowed this to happen, and so on and so on. But the trouble is, we're in very murky water. I mean, humans, for those like me who haven't religious faith, trying to talk about what on earth God understood 13,500 billion years ago, there's a lot of uncertainty.
I think we ought to just add the point, the physics. No, if we'd had a panel of physicists, of course, they would have said the first thing they would have pointed out is that the universe has to be this big and this old in order for us to be here. Because only in the dying moments of second generation stars do you get the generation of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus and oxygen of which our bodies are composed. And it turns out you just have to have a universe this big in order to get that far, to get this second generation stars in order that we might be here. So actually, the anthropic argument is the universe has to be this old in order for us to be here. So there is a strictly scientific answer to actually that question. Right, now we're going to, look at 20 past 4. I think we should probably finish there. I know there's a lot of people sitting on the floor. It's very hard for those of you sitting on seats. I think we should sympathise with them. I just want to make 3 points really. First of all is to invite everyone warmly to a lecture that will be held in here on Tuesday, April the 28th at 5:30 p.m. It will be given by Professor Ken Miller from the United States from Brown University. It's going to be about intelligent design. Ken Miller is one of the major North American critiques, I have to say, of intelligent design and so forth. And he's a very good lecturer, so I do invite you warmly to that lecture. The second thing I want to say is we do have tea and coffee and probably other things I don't know, but they're at the back. So if you wend your way up and get up the stairs at the end, do make yourselves at home, come and chat in the panel, browse the bookstall. Thirdly, and by no means lastly, can we really thank very warmly our panel for their great work today.